Hello, welcome listeners to another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love hosted by Richard Ostler. I was surprised scrolling social media even at age 65, and on Instagram, somebody that I've been aware of but never really connected to, Natalie Brown, talked about a new book and that she's just written. And I thought, I want Natalie to come on the podcast and talk about her book as I read more about it. And here we are. Let me introduce a little bit about the book. I think it's a really cool book, and also introduce Natalie, who's joining us via Zoom from her home in Colorado. The name of the book, listeners, is called After Happiness, Living with Faith in a Time of Crisis. Written by Natalie Brown, is a thoughtful and timely exploration of what it means to remain faithful when life no longer follows a prescribed script. Drawing on personal experience, scripture, and cultural analysis, Brown examines how many Latter-day Saints have inherited expectations that righteousness should lead to happiness, stability, and prosperity, only to discover that real life is often marked by disappointment, grief, and uncertainty. In this deeply reflective work, she challenges readers to reconsider easy formulas for happiness and to confront the spiritual crisis that emerge when familiar promises seem to fail. Rather than offering simplistic answers, Brown I can't read sometimes, listeners, a richer, more resilient visions of faith, one rooted in mourning, courage, adaptation, and trust in God amidst life's upheavals. With insight and honesty, she invites readers to see suffering not as evidence of failure, but as an essential part of spiritual growth and discipleship. Both intellectually engaging and emotionally resonant, After Happiness is a compelling guide for anyone seeking hope, meaning, and a deeper faith in a world where certainty has given way to complexity. Holy cow, listeners, I just read that again and got kind of teared up with some of those sentences because my life reflects that, and maybe some of you do. And there's not many books in this space, so I'm super excited about this book. Let me embarrass Natalie a little bit and read a little bit about her. Natalie Brown is a lifelong Latter-day Saint based in Boulder, Colorado. She holds a BA from the University of Chicago, a JD from the University of Virginia School of Law, and a PhD from Columbia University in English and Comparative Literature. She practiced law before becoming a full-time writer and parent. Her work appears in the Salt Lake Tribune, Wayfarer, By Common Consent, and elsewhere. She is the editor of a critical edition of, I can't say that. Will you say that, Susan?
John Stevens' Courtship by Susan Young Gates, who was a daughter of Brigham Young and one of the earliest Mormon novelists.
There you go, listeners. She and her husband, Michael, are the happy parents of 2 boys. And this book will be out in late July. We'd like to invite you to an event at Compass Gallery. We'll put more information in the show notes. This podcast will be released before that event. It's a book signing and a chance to meet Natalie. That'll be on Thursday, July 30th at 6 p.m. That's Compass Gallery in Provo. We'll put more in the show notes about that. We'll put a link to Amazon in the show notes. We'll put a link to Natalie's website, which is Natalie, Natile, brown.com. And with that, I'm super excited to have this book. My life at 65, I see some of this in my own life. I call it the vending machine, where I thought if I put in quarters in a certain order at a certain time and I pressed C5, which was my happy outcome on a vending machine, everybody else seemed to got C5, but sometimes I got D4, and I thought, well, I put in the wrong coins, obviously, or I did something wrong. And I think your book is really needed for all of us, that sometimes things don't work out. And you're pretty brave and vulnerable in the book, which helps us all just realize we're not alone. So anyway, that's my 4-minute introduction. I'm super excited to have Natalie on the podcast, and we'll turn it over to her to share her story.
Well, thank you so much, Richard. And I am somewhat embarrassed by those credentials because the truth is I'm really good at going to school, but I'm not very great at careers, and that kind of do X, Y, and Z, and then you're going to make lots of money does not work for me. So Richard actually was like, oh, like, it's just so great that you've like written this book about failure. So yeah, I'm here to rep all those people who are not succeeding professionally or in their other pursuits and say that it's a good thing. Um, okay, so this book, I'll just tell you in a nutshell what the argument is, and then we'll talk more about why I thought it needed to be written. So, the basic argument of this book is that the messaging of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints became enmeshed with very secular, individualistic models of happiness discourse in the late 20th century. And, going back to your vending machine model, it was sort of like, well, these formulas will lead to happiness. And increasingly, a lot of the formulas that we were offered, and I think in particular, the model of the nuclear family that's in the Family Proclamation, are becoming economically or in other ways out of reach for large numbers of Latter-day Saints. Which is creating a bit of an identity crisis when our inherited formulas for happiness have broken down. And so I spend the first chapter of this book just tracing the rise of happiness rhetoric in the church in these last decades. And it was actually Patrick Mason who kind of attuned me to more of the quantitative data behind this. In one of his articles, he talks about how the phrase plan of happiness only appeared in one general conference address from the 1850s through the 1960s. And then there's like 2 mentions in the 1970s, 12 in the 1980s, 85 in the 1990s, 125 in the 2000s, and 132 in the 2010s. So we go from like this just not being the rhetoric to suddenly we are very invested in happiness discourse. And one thing I should have talked about in the book, but you always have these regrets after you write it and it's impressed. It's like I also should have charted the word joy. And joy is used even more frequently than happiness in the conference addresses, but it starts spiking up too. We start seeing like happiness and joy interchangeably. We have a very big embrace of this therapeutic, individualistic language. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that that as the church integrated with the broader economy in America and then started becoming global, it's harder to think about. It's harder to have those community institutions, and so we start becoming more individualistic because that's how our culture is going, and we're mirroring the broader American trends. But I think this has had a lot of consequences that we've done that, and that's the gist of what this book is about. But then, to Richard's point, it really did originate in feelings of failure. And it's like, why is happiness not working out for me? Why did I have all these expectations of happiness? And why, whenever I wrote in things like the Tribune, was the most frequent criticism that I'd received, like, well, that I'm not happy enough. Like, somehow my ideas are not happy and therefore they should be said. And so all of those things were floating in my head. And, so personally, I really wanted to be a professor. And that did not work out for us. My spouse is also an academic, and he went on the job market in 2008. And I realized very quickly that we were not going to land jobs in the same university, and that I kind of had a choice between, do I become a professor? Do I want to like live in the same city as my spouse and have a family eventually? And I chose my spouse, but that was really hard for me. And since then, the humanities job market in academia has just gotten tougher and tougher, and those aspirations are just, most of us who want those are not going to get them. And then I think, we're also living in a period of substantial political, economic unrest, I guess I'll call it, and going through a lot of cultural ruptures. And I think some of the things I really expected as a child growing up in like the prosperous 1990s, housing families, that America was this global leader, have really been under strain. And so I don't know. So a lot of this book originated with like okay, like what I expected is not happening. This sort of these formulas that I inherited about what it means to be a good life, what it means to be a good Latter-day Saint are not quite working anymore, and I don't know what's next, and I don't know what to do with my grief for the loss of all the stability that we had, and, yeah, so that's I don't know, that's kind of where this all began. So, I don't know, Richard, do you what do you want me to say or talk about
Well,
next?
just thanks for being so brave and vulnerable and honest in that
Yeah,
last segment. I mean, super
yeah.
brave just to talk. I mean, obviously, you've got this wonderful academic background that took a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of emotional capital, and then to come out of the other end of that and have that not be what you hoped it would be for all those years of is pretty honest and pretty brave. And when you use the word grief, that's pretty honest. And so just thanks for being honest, Natalie.
Oh, no, you're welcome, and
Respect.
I one if there's one thing I actually hope my book does is that it opens up the ability to talk about these realities of failure, that our economy is not working, that our environment is under stress, that many of us do not have the opportunities that we were expected we were going to have in earlier decades. And I'd like to tell people that I don't think it's their fault. Like I remember I was at Columbia, and so the Bushmans in my ward, and I love the Bushmans, and I would like nothing more than to be like Richard and Claudia Bushman. Like
Mm,
they're my heroes. And I just have had to come to terms with the
mm.
fact that academia has changed a lot, the cost of living has changed a lot, and most, I think, LDS female scholars who head down this path are not going to end up having the same opportunities as like a Claudia Bushman or Laurel Thatcher Ulrich. And it's okay. We can admire that and want that and also start accepting the reality of our times and forging new paths. I don't know what they're going to be yet, but that's our task. So,
Keep sharing. You're doing
yeah, so
great.
failure. Yeah. Yeah, I'm actually of the persuasion that no one really likes books about, oh, if you just do this, you can end up bouncing like career and family because it just makes all of us underachievers feel badly because those are all the exceptions. So I don't know. This is more the average results, I think, and let's talk about that. So but I don't, but I actually, I think that does segue though into some of the, critique of happiness culture I give in this book is that I think very much we developed a culture in which our happiness became used as evidence of the gospel's truth. I mean, I remember hearing all the time, like, oh, missionaries would inquire as to why Mormons are so happy. And those kinds of stories would circulate. I really noticed this when becoming a mother, in fact, too, and that I was a stay-at-home mother for portions of my time, which, as I've just said, I didn't necessarily want to be. I really wanted to be a professor and a mother, but that didn't work out. So I was a stay-at-home mother. And, people would always tell me my choices were okay because they made me happy. They were not making me happy. But it was more a language, I think, of that. Well, we have to defend our religion because it makes us happy, because we're doing our own thing. And you start to see in a lot of the general conference talks that they'll start talking over and over again how it's like, well, if we follow this gospel formula, then we'll get happiness. And happiness is never really defined. It's just like conclusorily evidence of our truth. It's just kind of a conclusion that we say we're happy. Um, but then sometimes I think there is an actual expectation that we feel happy when we hear this language. And so you also get a number of conference talks trying to make sense of like why wrong choices can feel happy while right choices don't. And it gets into a lot of this mess. In fact, I am not LGBTQ, but I do think one of the reasons we see feminism and LGBTQ saints becoming I'll call it a problem for the church in this era is that the fact that people are following the church's formulas and don't feel happy is a theological crisis when the whole messaging of the church is that this is the plan of happiness. And so what do you do with the fact that people might not feel happy on those scripts? And I also think you start to see a lot of stigmas developing around unhappiness. Like, what do we make of people with mental health problems? What do we make of people who might not fit this mold? And I think what I see the most today, or that the issue that concerns me the most today, is how we've also developed quite a prosperity gospel, I think, that we see in like today's influencers, the fact that Utah is now associated with wealth and Utah curls and a certain aesthetic, because I don't know, like these material outcomes start becoming evidence of happiness, which is evidence of our truth. And it becomes a huge pressure to perform what we have decided looks like happiness, to perform the happy family, to perform the happy household, to perform again these certain aesthetic choices. And then we could also talk about how, happiness is a performance and it has to be done over and over. And so there becomes all these concerns about scrupulosity, or maybe we call it anxiously engaged and think that's all a good thing. But I think you can see all this kind of happiness, what this all does. So yeah, I don't know.
Super resonates with
Yeah.
me. You said you've said a couple things that just no one said on the podcast that really resonate with me. And happiness, evidence of gospel truth. You just gave that, and I wrote that down word for word in big capital
Yeah.
letters, Natalie. That's super interesting. And I've thought about this subject a lot. I don't I don't want this to be my story, but I get
No, tell me.
triggered. I get triggered in church when I hear talks about happiness as a choice and joy as a choice, because my mental health has never been terrible, but it's been at the point
Yeah.
sometimes, listeners, in my life where I just can't. My brain doesn't release the chemicals to feel happy or feel joy. It's not a choice for me, and
Yeah.
and I feel like I guess I'm gone to enough therapy that I understand that it's not a direct link between living the gospel and being happy. I've had to do what you're writing about, but I have felt like the thing that's in my control is peace, that I can control peace in my life. I can get there where I'm at deep peace and acceptance of my station in life. And I think the gospel helps me do that. But for me, anyway, joy and happiness are sometimes outside of my control. And I've never heard anybody talk about the plan of happiness and go through the history of that, Natalie, and just the research you've done to help. And maybe Patrick Mason did this too, is just to realize these things sort of creep into our culture, and then they maybe take a life of their own that's not healthy and productive. So
Yeah.
keep
No,
sharing. Keep
yeah,
sharing.
you've said so much there that really resonates with me. Like I think I think if I had to go back in time with today's psychological categories, I think I would probably be diagnosed as somewhere on the spectrum. And I too struggle to feel that kind of happiness and belonging that I don't know that we think. I mean, and I think maybe that's why I became so attuned to this issue is I felt so much judgment about the fact that I could not perform the happiness that is valued in our culture. And when people kept criticizing my Tribune articles and saying they weren't happy or why couldn't I just be more positive, I realized that actually wasn't a value for me. Like happiness is not something I value. Like it's not what guides my life. I'm interested in learning, I'm interested in empathy, I'm interested in self-improvement, but I'm not necessarily that invested in happiness, and I think that has to do with my own brain chemistry too. So I'm not no judgment on anyone who is, but it was a I think my brain chemistry gave me a different perspective that helped me look at this topic from a more analytic lens. But I do think it does lead to, like said, I think it can lead to a real theological crisis when the rhetoric is this leads to happiness and we don't feel happy. And I have come to a very similar perspective that you have, is that what Christ offers us is peace. I mean, that's what we hear in the temple ceremony. That's what he says, like, my peace I give unto you. I'm ever gonna get the quotes, or peace in this life, eternal life in the world to come. And I have come to think that that is what we should be striving for, not necessarily euphoria or the trappings of what we currently associate with a happy life. Because those things I think are very entwined with American capitalism and wealth and what we are being marketed to and asked to buy into is a kind of happiness. But I have a lot to say, so cut
Keep
me off
going.
if you want.
No,
Okay,
keep
but
going.
you
You've
know,
got
I think
44, we got 40 more
yeah.
minutes of Dr. Natalie Brown. So keep
Okay,
sharing.
excellent. You know, so I was recently at the Mormon Scholars in the Humanity conference, and I gave a talk about my book with my brilliant co-panelist Diana Brown, who is not actually related to me, although I wish she was. And she does the Soloist podcast, and she talked about in some ways how these like therapeutic models of like I know stages of faith have crept into a lot of LDS podcasting dialogue now. And she made a point that's really stuck with me, and I think is actually part of the point of my book too, is that you know we did need, I think, as a church to have a correction towards more personalization, more individual flexibility. But then the question, I think, is once we've kind of done and processed that, is what does it mean to then go back and participate in institutions that are never going to fully affirm us and align with our values, but that we need if we are going to function as a society and actually serve people and love people. And it kind of reshifted my thinking from, you know, this sort of, is the church making me happy? Which is an important question. And I think we all do need to assess that, because that is, you know, how people feel has been overlooked for too long. But when we start working that out, it's also, I think about, what am I willing to give up of my own happiness? Like, what sacrifices am I willing to make? And how do I have a conversation about what it means to live in a world that is never going to reflect my values perfectly? So I think I'm rambling on here, but I think a consequence of happiness rhetoric in our church is that we have been trained to feel that, well, we should feel happy here, right? And that things should align with what we think. And that is just not what the gospel says. If we start looking through the scriptures and through our history, I think in some ways, you know, the 1990s when I was raised was such an exceptional historical moment. It was the Cold War was over. We were talking about government surpluses and whatever problems we had, there was such a sense of optimism. And now that I think I've lost some of that optimism in our current timeline, I'm realizing that I'm nostalgic for something that was a historical anomaly. Like, this was never. It was easy to believe those ideas when the world and my life were going really well. But I like, you know, when I think about the Book of Mormon, and they don't even like talk about about the Great Society after Christ came to visit the Americas. It's mostly all problems, and that's what most of life is, right? Is things not going our way, not affirming us. And then how do we live within that chaos and disappointment? So I don't know. Okay, you say something because I'm rambling.
You're not rambling. It's like we're going out to lunch and you're just sharing what's on your mind. You said a couple, you know, and this is a subject that I've become more aware of through our own kids, is the financial pressure of raising families today compared to my generation. I'm 65, and our kids are struggling to afford homes. Our kids are not going to have as many kids as we had, and I've been at peace with that, or choose to have no kids. But yet sometimes I hear the senior leaders of the church kind of talking about getting married younger and having more kids and having kids right off the bat. And I wish we would, and I don't know if you want to get into these spaces, I wish we would just trust people to make their own decisions and support them on whatever path they felt was best for marriage, timing of marriage, number of kids, timing to have kids, and just really trust people and support. Like back you said, the very thing about the nuclear families being challenged, it's not being challenged because we're unfaithful. I think it's being challenged because of economic pressure and the reality of life. And then I wish we had we've just had a worldwide fast from the church in early July for religious freedom, and I wish we fasted for more economic opportunities for Latter-day Saints,
Mhm.
and and all the poverty and all the wars and all the divisiveness. ICE is something I'm going to fast for this Sunday after some more ICE murders that have occurred, and fasting for that. Now, it's a personal tangent for me, but I sometimes wish we addressed the realities of the economic situation and because I think a lot of us that are talking at General Conference, I'm sort of part of that age group now, grew up in a time where it was just easier, to your point, and we don't really sometimes, people like me come across tone deaf in the realities of raising a family and the complexities of that. So just some thoughts as you're talking and opening some of the thoughts in my mind. And it's really complicated and really tricky.
Mhm. Okay, so I have now a lot of thoughts, so prepare for another ramble because
Good.
you had a lot of
'Cause we
thoughts.
really
So
wanna
we
hear-
need to I know we're just like connecting and have all these thoughts. So, it's interesting. So I'm probably best known to your listeners as a guest columnist for the Tribune.
And you do
And
a great job on
Oh,
those
thank
columns.
you.
It's one
Yeah.
of the ways I know you.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm actually going to even ramble more. I'm going to talk to you about how I was recruited for the Tribune.
Good.
So yeah, so I was really struggling with the idea of paying tithing because I'm like, I am an unpaired well, I think at that time in my life, I can't remember if I was working part time or just jobless. But the reality was, though, I was like, I super need to send my child to preschool. Preschool now costs like 20,000 or something a year for part time preschool in our
I
area.
had no
And
idea.
I know, and I was like, the amount we're about to pay in tithing is the tuition bill for that.
Wow.
And I was like really struggling with this idea of being like, does this even make sense? And I ultimately decided to pay my tithing. And I get into it with a book about why I think tithing is actually really important. But I wrote a blog post for By Common Consent just about how conflicted I am about all this and why I ultimately decided to pay it. And then Peggy Fletcher Stick read that article, and recruited me to write for the Tribune because they wanted someone, I guess, who was a more of a within the church voice. And it said it will shock all my readers to know that I am a tithe-paying member who attends church regularly. But I don't remember where I was going with this, but yeah, most of my articles for the Tribune focused on how economic pressures are changing religious life. And I think and sometimes failure and disruption is an opportunity because what happened is like we had just moved to Boulder. I had been working at a law firm for 3 years, a big law firm in DC. My spouse was a tenured engineering professor, and we could not afford a house that we liked, even having two like rather large incomes because the things had just gotten so expensive. And so I started like this. So that actually, my housing trauma motivated me to go back to Columbia and finish my PhD remotely because I had actually
Wow.
dropped out of the program. When it became clear that I could get an academic job, a good tenured academic job at the same place as my spouse, and times had changed. Columbia was so amazing. Like my professors welcomed me back. Like you were able to do things remotely. Then I had the most fun of my life writing a dissertation about writers who were experiencing housing precarity. It was awesome. But I think that to the point I was going to make, I think a lot of these affordability issues just happened in Boulder about 5 years before they happened in Salt Lake, which kind of made my writing career. So we talk about, we can't afford a house, like our careers are in shambles, but this is a great writing topic. So that writing is where my heart is. So everything in my mind is it's an essay. And wow, this catastrophe of my life is a great essay opportunity. And it just happened to be one that I think started to resonate nationally just a few years later. But it's become very, our ward has lost so many families, and some of it's been people leaving the church, but a lot of it is that families just can't afford to live in the area anymore. And, so even with two incomes, at least at some points in our life, we just decided like 2 kids was kind of the most we could afford. And, a comparison that I sometimes make is that my spouse's parents lived a block away from our current house when they were postdocs. I think they had 4 kids at the time, and on a single postdoc salary, they were living in a neighborhood that we can, like, barely afford to live in, and today could not afford to move into. And it's just yeah, it's different. Um, and what's really changed for me about the proclamation of the family. Okay, so I'm gonna start by saying it's like I hated the proclamation of the family as a child. And I think it was appropriate to feel a little frustrated as a young woman who was years away from getting married or having kids and sort of did need to be focused on how I was gonna make my way in the world. But today, when I think about the proclamation of the family, yes, it was like overly prescriptive. Yes, it's exclusionary of some identities. That's all true. But my primary feeling today is just envy that people, when that was written, could reasonably expect that they could raise a family on one income. And I'm astounded that that is my reaction today. That's just a future I could not have imagined, where this role that felt so restrictive to me of like being a stay-at-home mom is something that now seems like this luxury that's out of reach for my generation, and that so few people I know are able to access. And it's so funny that I actually do think it's like a tragedy that people cannot afford to have families, even though my younger self would have said something very different. And that's not to say that the other criticisms are not true, but that's my reaction today, and I am stunned by that. Like, now that I actually am a mother, and uh, for most of the last 10 years have been purely a stay-at-home mother, although sometimes I've also gone back and forth into the workforce. I am one of the very few people in my ward who has children at home, and that is stunning to me, just like absolutely stunning. Um, so that was just to one point about family proclamation. Oh yeah, and then you were talking about marriage ages, and like it's to me the catastrophe is that it's what's tragic is that if when people want to make a choice to have families and can't because of economic reasons, um, and to some extent, I actually am sort of a believer in the fact that, well, if you follow your inspiration, things will work out. Like, um, I I think that is actually somewhat true, but I also certainly in my own life make very pragmatic decisions based upon what we can afford. And as I've told people who might be considering these problems, it's like, that the church is not paying for your family. And I think ultimately it does need to be a personal decision for the people who are going to be raising the children and paying for them, about what bandwidth mentally or financially they have. But all that said, I mean, I don't have any prescriptions to offer and when people should get married, because I think it really is an individual choice. So we need to be led by the Spirit, I think, on those questions. And I don't know. I'm just interested in the economics of it all and how it's reshaping things, and how wards are shrinking, and what this all means for the church. So
Those are just great insights and honest observations from your own experience and from others. So thank you. I love you using the word affordability. I think that's my favorite word to frame this. And if I'm fasting for better affordability. And I
yep.
think it's good you bring us back to a time when the proclamation was written and the assumptions that maybe were reality for the most part, that people could survive on one income. And we've never sort of really, and we've talked about women's places in the home, and we don't say that anymore. We've never untaught some of those things. Sometimes I
Mhm.
wish we'd have a talk where we said, this is what we said, and we don't teach that anymore. So please, this is what we teach. And
Yeah.
I,
That's interesting because a few weeks ago, I know there was a big social media blow up about, I don't know, some podcasters or influencers were claiming that the church had never preached that women should stay home. And then people who were older were like, no, they did preach that women should stay home. And my favorite response to all of this was from Susan Hinckley on the Last She Said It
She's
podcast.
awesome.
Yeah, she's awesome. And she talked about, I think it was the Sermon on the Mount. I'm going to have to blank on exactly which Jesus discourse this was. She says, Jesus provided the perfect model for how to signal change in a way that is not erasing the real sacrifices of people who lived under the prior teachings. And she says, in his sermon, he goes, "You have heard this, but now I say this." And I do think he's provided a great model of how we can shift our doctrine in a way that's transparent and acknowledges the past and the real sacrifices made, but that helps move the gospel or adapt the gospel to the future in a way that keeps the gospel resilient and alive and approachable. So Susan Hinckley is brilliant. You should all go listen to her. So.
No one's ever talked like that on the podcast. That does resonate because Jesus would talk about a new law, and this is why the old law that we taught, he didn't gaslight
Yeah.
people, say we never taught that. He
Yeah.
just pivoted and said a new law in a positive, hopeful way, and the why, and acknowledge the old law. So that's pretty powerful, and it's a pretty good role model when Jesus is doing that perhaps we can learn to do that as an institutional church. That's awesome, Natalie.
Yeah, well, and I think that's what you're doing, and actually, my second chapter of this book is about the importance of mourning and acknowledging unhappiness, and that's something that we don't like to do, and we often, I think, really have trouble fulfilling those baptismal covenants to mourn with those who mourn because we are unwilling to see their feelings and their problems in the first place, or maybe we're not even entirely capable of it. And I really like a late religious scholar named I'm going to mispronounce his name, but it's Walter Brueggemann, and he talks about when the Israelites were in Egypt, they began to voice their complaints to God. And I think he talks about how like real criticism begins in the capacity to grieve because it's the most visceral announcement that things are not right. And he's like, once we recognize that, once we are actually willing to see the problem and mourn, we can have a new social and theological reality emerge, and hopefully one that's an improvement and not one that goes backwards. But that ability to see unhappiness, to see grief, to see our failures, I mean, I think there's a reason why that's in our baptismal covenant, because we're not actually here to just pat ourselves on the back. Like, we're here to understand the problems around us and attempt to love people and to make things better. But we can't do that when we are so invested in the idea of happiness that we can't see where we're falling short of that idea. So
I love
don't
that. And
know.
I love
Yeah.
the masking we have to do if we have this expectation. When I sometimes sit in elders' quorum, I see us all, the front of our faces projecting. Maybe this is just me. Maybe no one else does this. I'm projecting sort of what I'm supposed to project in my happiness level. But in the back of my brain, there's all this stuff going on that I'm not safe. I'm not comfortable sharing here because I feel cultural pressure
hmm
to present myself in a certain way and act in a certain way and say things in a certain way. And my wife and I have been serving in a YSA ward, an older YSA ward, where it's 26 to 35, and it's different there. It's better. The YSAs are, and by that age, if you're not married, you're kind of recognizing things. You've had some curveballs in your life, and you're a little more real and a little more vulnerable.
Yeah.
But I've loved that the masking going on there is lower than it is in my home residential ward, and the vulnerability and the way to really help people and connect authentically, like you're bravely doing in your book and in this
Yeah.
podcast, helps people.
Yeah. And I think actually the failure of our formulas and our ideas can be such an opportunity for growth. So when I went back to write my dissertation and went back to Columbia, it was so liberating, and I was able to come up with my ideas were so much better than when I was initially in the PhD program and had this idea that I needed to go on the academic job market, because suddenly all like before, I was just crippled with anxiety about, oh, okay, I have to check this box and this box and this box, and I have to position my topic in this way so that this path will happen. And it wasn't really until I was just liberated from the expectation of having to go on the job market that I really could find my voice and talk about the things that were interesting to me, which ironically, I think are the subjects that are actually interesting to most people. And that if we, read about more, we'd be a lot more relevant and in demand because most of us are not super successful. Most of us do. Okay, so we had a brief technical pause, but we're back and we're talking about how most of us are not super successful. And, I think this book, I mean, the real impetus for this book, I think began when I was at home during COVID with two toddlers, and people were telling me I should be more grateful for this experience and that I should like value my motherhood more because it was really, really unpleasant to be isolated with two toddlers and no support for quite some time. And I started reading the Book of Mormon, I just every day, and I just started being like, yeah, this book, yep, it's the most inspired book. It explains their political situation. It explains the feelings I'm feeling about church right now. I just sort of checked off all these boxes for me, and I, sorry, forgive me. There's actually a little bit of smoke in our air today, so I'm having a few respiratory problems. Yeah, we were also in an even worse fire season in Boulder in 2020, so I was all alone, no job, our political situation in America is falling apart. I'm breathing in ash every day. And that was a very low point in my life. And I wasn't attending church then because of some our own health choices. And I should say I was not physically attending our ward building. I was putting on church for my children every Sunday at home. But some people on the board had started calling us inactive because they just didn't see us in the building. So they did see me like alone, desperately wanting help here as I tried to like read scriptures and put on sacrament meeting. And that's probably the moment where this book really began. And it was me just reading the Book of Mormon every morning for my spiritual practice and deciding that the Book of Mormon, like everything that was going on, was happening in the Book of Mormon. And I just really, really liked Nephi. And I think I had always disliked Nephi before because I saw him as this like perfect football captain, following the rules, that everything works out. And I realized that everything I had learned from LDS art in the primary manuals about Nephi was wrong. And I started rereading it. And like Grant Hardy's work, I think, was really inspirational here to me too. And that, yeah, Nephi is writing this in the promised land from the perspective of an older man who knows that his entire life's work has been a failure and who has lived through like the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of his family. And now here he is all alone with like half of his family trying to like rebuild civilization. And I suddenly just saw the Book of Mormon and Nephi anew and thought so much about him as a model for how we can handle our own moments of societal stress when a lot of the formulas that we grew up with have stopped working. And I think what's really interesting is that Laman and Lemuel are actually the ones who keep obsessing about happiness. When Nephi needs their help building the boat, I think they tell him something like, well, if we had just stayed in Jerusalem, then we might have been happy. And I thought it was so interesting that they were the ones focused on happiness. And the thing that just struck me to the core was that I so easily could see myself being Laman and Lemuel because I was really struggling to accept that a lot of the economic and political ideas that I had grown up with and that I thought were core to being an American and core to being a Latter-day Saint were collapsing, that my own civilization was failing and to some extent. And it was like, Laman and Lemuel, like they were just trying to follow what were the traditional religious teachings of the day. And like Jerusalem was the land of their inheritance. That was, I mean, that was their faith, their society. And like here I was like unable to even accept the comparatively minor changes that were occurring in my own. And I had so much nostalgia during that period of my life, and it was like, oh, it was so much better in the 90s. Why were it like my parents just don't understand how everything had like fallen apart now in my life. They had it so much better. Like the future is doomed. And seeing that kind of attitude in Laman and Lemuel and realizing that it was their over clinging to the past traditions that were they were probably taught were like, this is the gospel, this is, you know, this is our country. They probably were taught all those same sentiments, but they weren't willing to adapt when there was a change. And I thought Nephi, I just started loving him, not as someone who follows these clear-cut commandments, but as someone who really was, as he says, like led by the Spirit, not knowing what he should do. And then out of that collapse of Jerusalem, he develops a much more expansive theology, one that starts to, you know, take a big picture of human history, incorporate more about Christ, expands the idea of the promised land to a more global covenant. And I don't know. I mean, it's entirely bleak. He sees this vision saying that, like, yeah, all of your descendants are going to be killed by Laman and Lemuel's descendants. This whole project is going to fail. But like he kept going, and he looks to his own father for examples, and he's able to just keep loving, keep going, and keep passing on things that ultimately I think become quite a lot more expansive. And I just thought, you know, this is the message we need to hear. It's not the Nephi who follows clear commandments. It's the Nephi who confronts the fact that his own civilization and the forms of his worship have failed, and learns to embrace the unknown.
Wow, Natalie.
Mm.
That's
No.
I love that you're turned to the Book of Mormon and thought, are there answers here that will be helpful for me? And then you know the story of Nephi super well, and to read that through that lens, that's I've never read it through that lens.
Yeah, and
That's
Grant Hardy is really good here too. Like Grant Hardy, he has. I'm blanking on the name of his book, but he does a very psychological reading of Nephi, and you
interesting.
should read him too if you're interested in this topic.
But you know, the plan of happiness, how did that apply to Nephi? How would he feel about that? And seeing all the things you just reminded us of his journey, that's super powerful. And
Yeah,
I love the Psalms of Nephi where he's vulnerable about his, you know, he's one of the guys that you're right, he's this leader we think of, but he's also super vulnerable at times in what I call what people call the Psalms of Nephi. And then as you were talking, I thought of the stripling warriors who did have this amazing outcome, you know, with I
yeah,
think they all
yeah,
lived, and we talk about that
yeah.
story and sort of equate back to your point about prosperity gospel or the happy outcome. Of course, it's a happy outcome for all the stripling warriors, those young
Yeah.
warriors to survive. And I don't want to take anything away from that story, but you remind us Nephi's story is very different. And he did see the future of his people being destroyed. And what would that feel like? Holy
Yeah.
cow.
And, you know, and I think both of those experiences are true. Like sometimes you pay your tithing and get invited to be a guest columnist for the Tribune as a result. And other times your career collapses, and choosing your family over that career means the loss of your identity and loss of
Wow.
income. And all those things are true, right? And sometimes I think we need those positive miracles to maybe give us the faith to do the much harder things that someone like Nephi was asked to do. Because Nephi had some very compelling spiritual experiences, and he was asked to do some very hard things. And maybe they're all in there together. So I yeah,
Keep
I think they're
sharing, keep
together. Yeah.
sharing
I
more
don't
parts
know.
of your book or more things you'd like our listeners to hear.
So I think maybe I'll go a little bit into I am not offering solutions to our present problems in this book, and I'm certainly not asking us or giving us formulas for being happy. As I said, I think what you said about how our goal in this life is really peace and to keep going and keep striving, even if our goals might be doomed to failure. But I have been thinking about, I do think as a lot of these cultural formulas we have are now out of reach. I do see the church having an identity crisis about what keeps us together. It's like we necessarily went in a more individualized path. We now have like, I don't know, the family centered church, or we all we have the 2 hour block and we're all supposed to be making up for this at home. So I think in a lot of ways, like getting rid of some of those very prescriptive formulas that probably you and I were raised with was necessary, especially in a global church where some of those formulas did not culturally translate. But I think the real question I'm left with is, you know, individualization is great, but then for me, there's a gap of community now left. And I am surprised by how much I miss the 3 hour block, and I miss the programming, and I miss knowing that all of my other Mormons would not be drinking coffee, or like, I just miss those things that gave us identity. And I think the real question we face is sort of how do we create that identity in a much bigger church? And I think I have an English PhD, so I am just a textual, more literary person. But I do think it makes sense to kind of turn back to the scriptures for like a lot of our basis of identity, because I mean, these are global works that were produced by many different peoples, have like lasted in some cases thousands of years, because there's some truths in these stories that, even though they're particular to the locations, they have things to teach us about what it means to follow the Lord in a variety of situations. And I really liked like Emily Bell Freeman's New Young Women's Names. I thought
Hmm.
at first I heard, oh, the name should be like deaconess, teacher, priestess, and I was like, oh yes, of course those should be the names. But then she talked about how the names that she came up with, like she just kept going back to the scriptures. She kept rooting them in scriptures. And I realized I actually liked the names she came up with even more than like priest or priestess, because they emphasize purpose and what it means to live the gospel rather than just an office of the gospel. And I think, I don't know, I just like the idea of like rooting ourselves more in these shared traditions and talking about scriptures more, and like what does it mean to apply these principles to our particularities. But I don't know. So I'm just rambling,
I love that.
rambling on there. But I do like this idea of like, let's get back to our scriptures. Let's study them more. Let's look at them afresh about what these people are actually doing, what they're actually feeling, and not bring our formulas, like not read them through the lens of our pre-existing formulas, but let them burst our formulas and show us something deeper that we've maybe been overlooking.
Keep
I don't
sharing. That was
know.
great.
Yeah. But yeah, I don't. Okay, so I could talk about a lot of things though. Like what would you like to hear about? Do you want to hear more about like
Tell us
what
about,
I think are the challenges of the church? My right? Oh, sorry, I cut you off. Yeah, go ahead.
well, that's a good question. I don't know. We've got about 10 minutes or so. I
Okay,
love
yeah.
this line you said. Failure, you said this about 20 minutes ago, failure and disruption and opportunity. So you've felt some of this. We've all felt some of this
Yeah.
but you've still said this is an opportunity. Talk about that for
Yeah.
other people, because you're walking this road. It's not like it's
Mm.
theoretical. You've walked this road of disruption and some failure, and but talk about that a little bit, or talk
Yeah.
about another chapter in your book, or another.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about that. So first of all, I'm gonna have to say I hate the idea of disruptive innovation. I disruption is often disruption, and it often hurts a
Hmm.
lot of people. And I think most of us would prefer stability rather than living in constant disruption. But if disruption is forced upon us, whether or not we want it, then I mean, the only thing we can do is learn from it and understand, well, what were we getting wrong in the past that led to this disruption, and what can we do about it. And, I will be totally honest that I am kind of pessimistic about our ability right now to enact a politics that's going to end up better than the one that we left behind. But, I was thinking about the Old Testament stories that were in Come Follow Me last week. And, you know, Christ does not vanquish Israel's enemies. There's always kings of Syria invading. He doesn't get rid of the Romans when he's on earth. I think what he asks us to do is see how in our own little areas can we keep making the right choices, keep going, find peace, forgive people, and just keep living. And maybe this opportunity will not that we have now in this cultural rupture or whatever you want to call it, maybe this isn't going to end great in terms of what institutions come out of this, or what kind of knowledge comes out of this, or what kind of a society comes out of this. Maybe we get the worst case scenario, but as I do think but it is an opportunity, I think, for each of us individually to examine what our faith really means, and whether it's about happiness or whether it's about peace, and think hard about those phrases like enduring to the end, and maybe some of the values that we forgot about in a really happy time, and now have an opportunity to explore more deeply. In fact, I was thinking about my dissertation, and my favorite author is Charlotte Bronte, and I was recently in Westminster Abbey, and I was looking at the monument there to the Bronte sisters. And today, when you read a book like Jane Eyre, people like to think about Jane Eyre. They don't always, but I think people like to think about Jane Eyre as like this feminist hero. But what's written on their monument is I don't know if it's the power to endure or the courage to endure. But they and people of their generation saw real value in just these everyday acts of surviving and keeping going. And I think we have a chance to think really deeply about our place in history and just what matters to us as humans. So it might not be an opportunity to create a better society, but it is an opportunity, I think, for each of us in our hearts to learn, to test our faith, I guess, and think deeply about what that means.
It's really
So,
thoughtful.
yeah.
When I think alone, I think of the big problems of the world, and sometimes, political diversity. I'm politically left, listeners, left center for sure, and I'm not pleased with some of the things going on in our country, and then I'm not really happy that our church doesn't address some of these issues. I look at the Pope and the way he is addressing the sort of the main topics that I feel worldwide need to be addressed. And I have holy envy, to coin a term I've heard from some of my institute teachers. I have holy envy of the Pope and his willingness to wade into some of these key issues, worldwide issues, and our leaders don't. And I love that I think, one of the things I just got out of your last segment is, at some point, I can't control that. And I have to live with that, even in my own faith community and my own country, and focus on what I can control. And maybe that's my heart and my soul and my ability to move forward.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I I also I went to a Catholic school growing up. I don't
Cool.
know if you knew that. So
I didn't.
so I went to a Catholic high school. So I really like the Catholic Church, and I think there's a lot we could learn from the Catholic Church as we become a more global faith, which we could talk about too. But I thought what the Pope has been saying recently, I mean, it's brilliant, it's needed, it's the message the world needs to hear. His comments on AI and about how human bodily weakness is important, and it's part of what we're here to learn through and with. I mean, they're just brilliant. I love everything he has to say. And I remember going into general conference, like kind of being like, wouldn't it be awesome if the prophet just went and denounced the people I disagree with, just like the Pope is doing? Like, that would be like so cool. I'm so tired of being harassed, of being told like unhappy, of like being judged all the time. And then he, of course, our prophet did, and he talked about the need to be peacemakers. And I kind of realized at that moment that I needed both of their messages. Like, I think the world does need a pope to be its like global moral leader, and that's kind of what the pope is to the world. And I really needed our prophet's message that I had to make peace, because me wanting the prophet to like call out my enemies is like a horrible emotion and completely anti-Christ-like, right? Because as much as I might think I'm right, I think what our scripture stories tell us again and again is that my job is to make peace and to forgive. And so I was just so struck by how, in some ways, the two together, I think, give me the message I really needed to hear. It's like, yep, there's some problems going on in our world that we need to think really hard about. And I also need to make peace and not let that anger dwell in my heart. And, what I haven't talked about yet is this book is also really a tribute to my dad. And my dad was an orthodontist, and he became disabled when I was a senior in high school. And he lost his entire career. And I think about what it meant for him to live with faith when he had 3 kids to support, his earning ability was gone, and he had so much reason to be angry and to be bitter, and he got over that, and he was a friend in the community, and he was someone who just, I think, really the Lord did just sort of provide, and he made peace with all this. And I remember there was a moment during COVID when I was so angry, and primarily at my fellow church members, because I've always, there's always kings of Syria, right? There's always bad political leadership that we might not like. But the fact that I felt like my fellow members of the church were part of the problem just stung me to the core. And, I kept reading the scriptures in the Book of Mormon, and it's like, you can kind of theoretically recognize that you should be forgiving, but not really feel able to do it. And my mom reminded me about my dad. And it was at that moment that my anger fell away. I was like, my dad had so much more to forgive than I did. He knew his body was only going to get worse, that there was no career to recover. And he moved on and became a better person and a better member of the community for it. And I kind of realized, we just have this choice. Like, we can be like Laman and Lemuel, who are understandably have a lot of nostalgia for like leaving Jerusalem behind and then dwelling in a wilderness, or we can accept what is and be open to the things we don't yet know, but that the Spirit can lead us to. And I also think sometimes I really do think it's just those human relationships that are so important to like reminding us that we've been here before, that other people have done it, and that we can do it together. So I don't know. And I guess I'm getting a little teary now. So maybe this is a good part to end. But I love Nephi's vision in the Book of Mormon when he sees our days. And I might be misremembering, so go back and fact check me. But he basically says there's only going to be 2 churches. It's like those who follow Christ and those who don't. Like, there's no Latter-day Saint Church or Catholic Church or all of this stuff. It's just like, you are or you're not following Christ. And he talks about how there's going to be very, very few people left following Christ. And that hit me so hard in this moment, that numerically we're probably going to lose. And that was always prophesied. But then he talks about how they will be everywhere in the world. And I just think that's also a wonderful, wonderful blessing, is that in the midst of all of this chaos, I have also had relationships with so many good people within our faith and without of it, who are striving to keep this hope alive. And, maybe that's all we can ask for and all we're going to get. But that is an amazing, amazing thing. And yeah. Okay, I'm getting a little teary now, so maybe we'll stop there.
Tell us your dad's name, and I sense he's passed away. Tell us when he passed away.
My dad passed away 7 years ago. And I don't put his name in the book because I don't think he would have liked it. So I'll tell you offline. But
Okay.
that I'm reserving for my friends because I prayed a lot to know if my dad was going to be okay with this book. And I got some really strong confirmations that he was. In fact, the publishing contract came through 7 years to the date he died. And in the epilogue of this book, I will tell you how he died. But
That's great. That's another reason to read the book.
that's the interest book. If you don't know how my dad died, you got to read the book. And I will say
That's great.
that in the midst of all of these horrible things going wrong with our world and my career and our lives and our environment, the one experience that should have been really horrible and that wasn't was my dad dying. And now, I mean, it was horrible in a lot of ways, but that is when I knew that our life continues on after that. And I don't know why I had that experience, but I don't know. I sometimes I think faith really is a gift, and it comes from I think faith is an external gift that comes through witnesses of the Spirit. At least that's how it's worked in my life. I just it's not something I can intellectualize, that actual conviction. And I don't know why. I don't know why I've had some really particularly strong experiences and that some people I know have not, but I think they're needed for some reason. And I know that the Lord wants me in this church, even if it is not a perfect church or an institution. And it's interesting that I was thinking that I've never actually really had a faith crisis. I think I've always really believed in the Lord my entire life. And I do think that's an external gift. I don't think that's from me. And there, for some reason, I think the Lord wants me to know this. But sometimes but that doesn't mean I don't struggle with whether our church is worshiping and structuring relationships in a way that is most Christ-like. And so I I question many things about our church and whether we are actually acting in a way that is Christ-like, but I've never really doubted that. And so that moment when he died was the moment I think I knew that there is a life after this. And so it ended up being probably the most joyous moment of my life. And for all the critiques that this book makes of happiness, I do think there is something beyond happiness and we'll call it joy for lack of a better word. I think there's no real word in the English language for this, but I'm going to go back to Nephi, who I've just decided I love after a lifetime deciding he was like this annoying paragon. But he talks about how he has felt the Lord's love so much that it like consumes him to the flesh. And that is what I felt when my dad died. And it just picked me up and carried me on. And it's so weird that in what should be the worst moment is when I felt that most strongly in my life. And I don't know. I think I'll end there. So,
Well, that's really tender stuff. And
yeah.
I love, I'm thinking of people like me and listeners that want to stay in the church. The church isn't addressing our concerns all the time. We don't feel like we belong because we're not part of the political majority. We see things a little differently, but there's a lot of people that are trying to stay. And I think your ministry, your work, your book, your voice really helps those that, because you don't have this all wrapped up in a tidy bow, Natalie. But you did hear something from President Oakes that helped you, even though the Pope addressed in a more global way that resonated with you. No one's ever put those two talks together as the sort of the right answer for them. And just this kind of deep acceptance that some of these issues, I'm just going to have to live with. The church may not address those right now, I thought that was really powerful. Instead of you suddenly changing so you fit in just perfectly, as I wrote down in big capital letters to you, keep being you. I don't think you need that advice from me.
You know what's interesting is I've never had a faith crisis in my knowledge of the Lord, but I have had a faith crisis in academia. And when it became clear to me about how the economic conditions of academia work and that I would not be able to get a job with my spouse, I was very depressed, and I had to really start thinking about, okay, how did this institution that I associated with all these progressive ideas and inclusion, how could it fail so spectacularly to be inclusive and progressive in practice? And so that was kind of my faith
Hmm.
crisis. And I think I learned that there's no perfect institutions out there. I will also say that, like, I can never remember not having a sense that, like, gender was not quite right in the church. Like, I've just been a questioner my whole life. And I think that's
Good.
actually what's helped me to stay,
Good.
because, you know, I'm not sure why the Lord wanted me in this church. My mom is a convert. I think I went to a Catholic school. There's people following the Lord everywhere, but I did feel I was put here for a reason. This is where he wanted me to be. And, I think institutions are vehicles for us to have relationships with other people and for us to learn how to exercise those. And I think asking the church or any organization to align with all of our values is a problem. And I think it is something that we're pushed to politically these days. And like our form of protest could be like, I don't know, boycotting things that don't perfectly align with us. And I understand that. And sometimes I do. There are some things I boycott. But I think this is this question that we're not talking about enough within the Latter-day Saint community is, okay, so we've individualized, we've claimed our own spiritual authority, but what kind of relationships are we still willing to make and have with people or institutions, which are vehicles for connecting people, when we know that no one is going to align with us or affirm us? Like, there's no institution out there that's going to affirm us, and like, institutions are not always there for affirming us, right? And what does that mean? And that this, I think for some people it probably is the right choice to leave our faith, because for some people that calculus is going to be different than for others. And I think I have a particular role to play in this church, and I'm sure many people would prefer that I was not a member of this church, because I like to draw attention to unhappiness. But I feel called to be here. I'm not sure that's true of everyone, and everyone's going to have to follow, I think, their own intuitions and guidance on that. But this question, I think, is a one not just for our church, but for our country and our world, is what does it mean to have relationships with people that we do not see eye to eye with? And where can we find common ground? What relationships are worth preserving? And that's something we just need to think about. I really like Carolyn Klein's work too. She wrote a book called Mormon Women at the Crossroads, and it looks at how, and I apologize if sometimes I still just slip into the word Mormon, but I don't know. LDS Mormon, I try. But anyway, her book is called Mormon Women at the Crossroads. And she looks at Latter-day Saint women in different countries outside of America. And one of the things she finds is that those women tend to have very different feelings and concerns than feminists in the United States. And I have to say that I read this book and was super depressed, because I was like, well, if all these global converts don't want my feminist ideals, does that mean like we're never going to have the reforms or structural changes I'd like to see? And I was like, I got really anxious, but her work is spot on. And I'm really hoping that this global nature ends up expanding our understandings rather than just shutting down change. But I wanted to say that because I think, even within the church, I think we're going to start having, the church is so big that people are going to have very different views on a number of topics, like in Africa. Caroline Klein also mentioned, like, a lot of same-sex anything is still illegal. It's a more patriarchal culture, and how the church is going to hold together, like, it's US saints who want maybe more progress on these issues with other ones who are attracted to the patriarchal nature. These are all just difficult questions, and we are going to have to really grapple as a people with how we balance, I think, our own intuitions and guidance with what it means to stay connected. And I don't actually have answers to that. So I am glad that that is not my jurisdiction, and that I could just focusing on listening, learning, and loving with the people around me. But
It's really great, Natalie. It's just
Hmm.
food for my soul listening to you and your vision and your honesty and the way you're navigating this in a brave, vulnerable, authentic way, the way you turn to the scriptures sometimes for stories that help you.
Hmm.
It's just really helpful for me personally in my own journey and relationship with the church. And I think it's helpful for listeners. And I think you give, especially for younger women and men, maybe some vision for them of what's possible and how to navigate the complexities of life. And so you're awesome. And I really mean
Oh,
that.
you are too. This has been such a wonderful conversation, and I'm so glad you reached out and that we connected because that's the best part of the church, I think, are the relationships we make.
So,
You know.
listeners, please check out the book is After Happiness. How about a book named with that title? Now we understand why it's named that title in a really thoughtful way. After Happiness, Living with Faith in a Time of Crisis. What a really needed book. If you're in Utah and want to go to the event on July 30th, we'll put that in the show notes. It's at the Compass in Provo. We'll put Natalie's website in the show notes. We'll put the Amazon link. This will be a terrific book to read, share with others, and just keep sharing your voice. It's so cool you acted on your impression to write this book and use your God-given talents to address really important subjects. So, and thanks for your courage to stay in the church that sometimes feels like you're don't quite fit the mold. And that's
But we can also create our own molds. I'm a big believer that we can create the community that we want to include us. We all feel like we don't belong. So,
that's awesome. I love
yeah.
that. So that's just awesome. So thank you, Natalie, for joining us from, I'm going to call you Dr. Brown. I love to just acknowledge that you have a PhD, and that's a huge accomplishment. But anyway,
Thank you.
this is
Thank
Natalie.
you, Richard. Yeah.
This is Natalie Brown and Richard Ostler signing off from another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love.